My name is Linda Smetzelar, and I am the Associate Provost of Outreach and Engagement. And I'm honored today to welcome you all to our University of Iowa campus. As you heard last night from Provost Butler, taking the arts across Iowa and further is really essential. And it was really also one of Grant Wood's legacies. Through our programs currently in my office, we are in 84 counties. There are 99 counties in Iowa, so we're very, very happy to be in many different schools throughout the state. And I think it's important to recognize that Grant Wood was a lifelong educator, and I think he would have been very happy with the work that we're doing in schools. Often in schools, when budgets are cut, the first thing to go is the arts. And so we are just very, very happy that through the work in my office, which is truly supported by Provost Butler, we are able to go to many communities in Iowa. Often we go into the schools and they don't want us to leave. So we're very fortunate. We partner with institutions who promote the arts, and I wanted to mention that. Certainly, Grant Wood is very highly regarded, and places where we have been, the Figge Art Museum, the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, the Dubuque Art Museum, and the American Gothic House Center, and many other places. What we are doing today very specifically is welcoming you to the campus to celebrate the life and legacy of Grant Wood. You will hear from 5 leading scholars conducting original research on Iowa's native son. At this time, I would like to introduce to you Jane Milosh, and Jane is a member of the Grant Wood Art Colony National Advisory Board. And this advisory board is led by Jim Hayes. And the board actively shapes what happens in this symposium and other aspects of the colony. Jane is the founding director of the Smithsonian Research Initiative in the Office of the Undersecretary for History, Art, and Culture. Jane was curator at the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and the Detroit Institute of Arts. In these roles, she contributed to several Grant Wood exhibitions, including curating Grant Wood's studio, Birthplace of American Gothic, in 2005. And this coincided with the renovation of the artist's historic studio in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, known as 5 Turner Alley. So please welcome Jane Milosh.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I don't want to say too many things. I stand between a whole line of impressive speakers. But since Linda ended up on telling you the last show that I curated on Grant Wood, which was about his historic studio, 5 Turner Alley, I just thought I would make one remark, because in connection with the symposium, it's very exciting in that we really bring together living artists who are now part of the Grant Wood Art Colony, and also leading art historians and scholars from around the United States to talk about Grant Wood in a broader context. So I just thought I would point out that, art is created to enter the world and to live. But how does that happen? It takes the generosity of many patrons to reach out to artists and support them even before they're well known or even could potentially be famous. Well, without John Turner, who owned the funeral mortuary, Turner's Mortuary in Cedar Rapids, who gave Grant Wood his old carriage house that he might just hang out up there and make some art, we wouldn't have Grant Wood today. Turner was an advocate and a patron and encouraged Grant Wood. He even had Grant Wood painting paintings to sell to other new mortuaries that were being developed in funeral parlors across the United States. Took him to conventions, as a matter of fact. So if that's not funny, I don't know what is. And even the door to Grant Wood's studio was actually the lid of a coffin. So if you showed up at his studio and Grant Wood was peering through the window, you thought, is he dead? Well, we heard about his humor last night. But I'd like to honor right now another patron, and that's Jim Hayes. And without him, we would not have the Grant Wood Art Colony. It takes these kind of patrons who really see the potential of what is needed in our society today, what is needed in the world today. And so it takes vision of artists working together with donors and patrons and the community, because otherwise you need all three of those things for this work to come alive. Why make something if it's not going to be out there? And so the thing about Grant Wood coming to the University of Iowa was a major thing, because not only was he a visionary and a very talented artist, he was trained as a craftsman originally, largely self-taught. He was really very engaged in intellectual pursuits. He was a reader. He was friends with poets, as we know. And so he was a very sophisticated artist, but it was his humor that was a very disarming thing that he used. And so I think the lecture last night was a perfect way to introducing us to the humanity of Grant Wood. And so as we move forward through the symposium, I just wanted to let you know that this is a very powerful thing that's been created here. This is the 5th symposium, but the Grant Wood artists, I'd like to have them stand up really quickly. Are they here? Hoping they're here. Our artist fellows. Okay, one, yes, fantastic. Thank you. So because I work at the Smithsonian and a lot of people think we have a lot of money, I like to remind them that actually your federal funds don't even cover our operating budgets. So we rely on the generosity of all of you to help give and participate with our projects. So later on today, when you see the film, there's going to be an opportunity for you to become a friend of the Grant Wood Art Colony for a mere $125. But don't let that figure stop you. We're always happy to take more. Because the project we need that support to keep growing. And maybe I would just say one more thing about the Art Colony, and then I will move on to introduce Wanda Korn, who will introduce our speakers, is what I find so spectacular and unique about the Art Colony compared to anything I've seen in the United States or even internationally lately, is it ennobles the challenge of making art in beautiful surroundings and in a community with other artists. Artists often work in a very isolated manner, and so this gives them a chance not only to be among other mid-career and emerging and established artists, it gives them an opportunity to live in a beautiful surrounding. So often it's like they're not given the dignity they deserve, and thanks to Jim Hayes, who had the vision not only to give Grant Wood's historic house, the second studio of Grant Wood, he managed to acquire all of the property around it to dedicate and paint these houses. So if you go by 1142 Court Street, you'll now see a beautiful entrance, a stone gate that signifies the Grant Wood Art Colony. So please take time to do that while you're here this weekend. So finally, it's my pleasure to introduce another legend, Wanda Korn. Wanda was a professor at Stanford for many years. I'm not going to go through her long CV because it's more than 40 pages. Because she's impacted more lives than anyone I know in the field of American art history. In fact, when I went into study art history, there wasn't American art history, it was American studies. Wanda Korn took that into the field of American art history. She is really the founder of this, and for our art association's founding groups, she has been the mentor, including to me, of many scholars, curators, artists, and so it's a real pleasure and an honor to work with her on the Art Colony Board, and also to continue to follow her amazing career. While she is Professor Emeritus at Stanford, she is very active in scholarship and research, and I was so excited to hear her next show will be Georgia O'Keeffe Living Modern, which actually looks at Georgia O'Keeffe's dressmaking and patterns. So it will be opening at the Brooklyn Museum of Art next year. And I think all of you, it will be a show you want to go see. It's also going to travel. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to our very distinguished Colony Board member, Grant Wood expert, the one who wrote the first book, Wanda Korn.
Excuse me. I don't know if this is important, but there's a piece of equipment on the floor here. Anyway, good morning, everyone, and how nice it is to have a beautiful Indian summer day, I guess is what we would call it, in New England, to have our conference this particular year. You know, it's the 125th anniversary of the birth of Grant Wood, and it felt important to somehow acknowledge that in the year that this occasion happened. And when a few of us, including Jane, sat down to think through, Joni Kinsey was another part of the thinking team about what we would like to do for the occasion, we realized that there are a lot of people working on Grant Wood that, in ways that are sort of a little left and right of him as an artist, that we really should be contextualizing and growing Grant Wood's scholarship, or seeing where it is growing, noting that growing, and giving a place for that scholarship to be demonstrated and expressed. So we put out a call for papers, and I don't know, we got something like 25, 30 possibilities, proposals, and very interesting ones indeed, and it was not easy to choose our 5 speakers today. But what was fascinating to me, as someone who did her work on Grant Wood back in the late 70s and early 80s, the exhibition book and book that I did was 83, it was fascinating to me to see, in fact, how much Grant Wood has become what you might say the hub of study, but there's many spokes that take that artist into bigger terrain. And that is what I think we're going to be hearing primarily about today. It's a very interdisciplinary group of speakers. My 3 paper givers this morning will be talking on things as varied as Victorian architecture, FSA photography, and storytelling in the 1930s. And after the 3 papers, we will have questions from you, so store them up. We won't break after each paper, but we'll have our speakers come and sit here and answer and handle questions, and I hope we have a good discussion about what these papers teach us about this artist. We're definitely in what I was thinking, how, we always use the word post now, postmodernism or post-identity or post-Warhol. Well, definitely what you're hearing today is post-Korn Dennis, Jim Dennis, who wrote another very early book, and post-Carol Ann Marling, who also contributed to putting the regionalists in general, but including Grant Wood, back into history in the 1980s. It's really hard for you, I suspect, to imagine what was going on back then when we did that work. I was actually called by a very noted art critic, Hilton Kramer, in his magazine, The New Criterion, psychotic for having revived Grant Wood and put him on the walls of the Whitney Museum. I think that was the word. I was trying to dredge this up last night, but it was a pretty nasty word. And his point really was, do we need to see this artist ever again? We've always known that he was basically, and then all the stereotypes of what the regionalists represented, figurative, overly nationalist, isolationist, painter of folk and local terrain. But all of that, in his mind, was not worth looking at again. So to a certain degree, the first few of us that began to look at Grant Wood, we weren't necessarily trying to say he's the greatest artist that ever lived. In fact, when people would say, which I think is very much a deep prejudice in the art history field, do you like Grant Wood? Is he your favorite artist? And I would say, historians study the rise of Hitler. Would you ask them if they liked Hitler? We're historians, and it's our duty to, in fact, use visual culture in all its manifestations to tell our histories and something of our past. So I always used to say that. I say, no, not necessarily. I have no favorites. My favorite, if I had one, is whomever I happen to be working on at the moment. But it's not a favorite in terms of sort of somebody I have to take home and hang all over my house. It's a favorite because it's the history I am learning through that particular artist. So what we were doing in the old days was really trying to reassess that movement called regionalism, which was very real, a term used during the 1930s, and we were trying to rethink what it must have been to be a member of the Depression generation and have these artists out there, as Erica so nicely did last night, helping us, if you will, as a culture, get through the Depression and have something. Very often these artists represented something to hold on to. Local histories, community activities, folk and folklore of various communities and so on. So it was really to not just put Grant Wood in the mix, but Thomas Hart Benton, John Stewart Curry, the WPA project, the FSA project in photography. Lots of government policies were suddenly looked at for the first time in the 80s to begin to assess what came out of those particular policies. So what we're seeing today now is really 20 years, 30 years later, what's happened to that scholarship, and I think it's going to be a very, very exciting morning. So let's kick off with Kerry Dean Carso's paper called Grant Wood and the Afterlife of Victorian Architecture. Kerry is a chair of her department and associate professor of art history at the State University of New York at New Paltz, and her research focuses on the interconnections between arts and literature in the 19th and early 20th century United States. Most importantly, I think, is her relatively recent book, 2014, that she authored called American Gothic, Art and Architecture, not American Gothic the painting, but American Gothic Art and Architecture in the Age of Romantic Literature, which was published by the University of Wales Press. And she won the very prestigious Henry Russell Hitchcock Award from the Victorian Society in America. She's currently working on a book entitled Follies in America, A History of Garden and Park Sculpture, 1776 to 1876. And she's also working on a project, which I think will probably relate to some of the things she's going to be talking to us today, on the afterlife of American Victorian architecture in the interwar years. She took her PhD in American Studies from Boston University. So today she'll be talking, and Kerry, I welcome you to the podium, on Grant Wood and the afterlife of Victorian architecture.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's my second extended visit to Iowa. I came here a little over a year ago when I started this project. It is a new project for me. My specialty is 19th century American architecture, and I've always been fascinated by American Gothic, and it's funny that Wanda should read the title of my book as American Gothic, because that was the publisher's suggestion for the title, and I thought everyone's going to get confused with Grant Wood. It's actually American Gothic Art and Architecture. And then I thought, well, that might actually sell some books, so let's let that go. That sounds good. It has nothing to do with Grant Wood, that book, but it has led me to this project. So I'm very excited to be here to talk to you about it. Here's my title. You've heard that. In the spring of 1930, Grant Wood accompanied a friend on a driving tour around Eldon in rural southeastern Iowa. As they approached the house on the corner of Burton and Hearn streets, Wood exclaimed, "Stop, there's a house I want to use." The object that had arrested Wood's attention was a small Gothic Revival house, seen here in a 1965 photograph. Built in 1881 and expanded in 1905, the Jacques House, also known as the Dibble House, demonstrates in its remote location the reach of Andrew Jackson Downing's publications in the 19th century. A Hudson Valley landscape gardener and horticulturist, Downing was a national tastemaker in the antebellum period. His architectural pattern books, including Cottage Residences from 1842 and The Architecture of Country Houses, 1850, exported the Gothic Revival style in domestic architecture from New York to the rest of the expanding nation, including Iowa. The house in Eldon had all of the characteristics of a Downing cottage, including a steeply pitched gable, a pointed arch window, board and batten siding, which accentuates the vertical thrust of the little house, and a prominent veranda across the facade. While the style of the house in its... There's a cough button, so I thought I'd use it. While the style of the house and its vertical boarding follows Downing's advocacy for Gothic Revival cottages in rural settings, the builder deviated from some of Downing's precepts. While the house sports a veranda, indispensable in hot weather, according to Downing, the Iowa builder breaks one of Downing's rules regarding the veranda, as it lines the entire facade of the house rather than just a portion. Downing had written, quote, "As the spirit of Gothic architecture lies in vertical lines, a long, unbroken horizontal line of veranda would destroy or mar the architectural character of the cottage," end quote. For example, in Design 2, which you see here, which is a cottage in the English or rural Gothic style, Downing, quote, "made the veranda 2 or 3 feet shorter at each end from the front and further broke the horizontal line with the porch balcony to the window in the front gable," end quote. Also, Downing likely would have found the pointed arch window in the little house to be overscaled. Maybe I'll go back so you can see it a little bigger here. Due perhaps to its having been ordered from an architectural parts trade catalog. In the 1880s, when the Jacques House was constructed, there were no less than 107 trade catalogs featuring prefabricated architectural elements. Factory-produced architectural components, including doors, windows, and staircases, were available in rural Iowa after the Des Moines Valley Railroad reached Ottumwa in 1860. Eldon was accessible as well, as the town owes its existence to the arrival of the Keokuk and Des Moines Valley Railway, followed by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. The plan of the Jacques House falls short of Downing standards as well. Downing writes that the principal entrance or front door should never open directly into an apartment of any kind, but always into a porch, lobby, or entry of some kind. And so here you can see it opens right up into the parlor. This is not the case in the Iowa House. Indeed, with its awkward proportions and lengthy porch, Downing probably would have classified this Iowa house as among the rural cottages designed by what he called uneducated builders. That's how he described them in the architecture of country houses. There's some New York bias, I guess. Whatever his deficiencies by Downing standards, Wood was eager to adapt the house for his own purposes. He made a sketch and later explained his intention of capturing the house for a painting he completed in 1930, of course. He wrote, quote, "Any northern town old enough to have some buildings dating back to the Civil War is liable to have a house or church in the American Gothic style. I simply invented some American Gothic people to stand in front of a house of this type." The result was Wood's celebrated painting, American Gothic. And of course, newspapers across the country reproduced the painting within its pages, and it's had many parodies. These are the ones that I found on display in Anamosa. Wood's remark that any northern town was likely to have an American Gothic building points to Downing's influence in the mid to late 19th century. Indeed, Gothic revival houses a la Downing proliferated in the mid to 19th century Iowa landscape. For example, the John Reichert House, built circa 1865 in the vicinity of Knoxville in Marion County, was constructed of brick with carpenter Gothic trim and an Italianate porch. The pointed arch window in the gable calls to mind the similarly positioned window in Wood's painting. Sadly, the Reichert House was demolished in the 1970s to make way for a highway, but not before it was documented for the Historic American Building Survey in 1976. Indeed, the history of preservation and documentation of historic structures is an important part of the story that I want to tell today. Over the years in teaching college courses on the history of American art, I have been struck by how many Gothic revival cottages appear in American art in the 1930s. Of course, there's American Gothic, but there are others. Here we're looking at Walter Evans's photographed Gothic revival house with Iron Gate, Poughkeepsie, New York, which I'll talk about today. Charles Burchfield's watercolor Lavender and Old Lace, and Lars Kufferman's print American Gothic from 1937. And I'm only going to talk about Wood and Evans today, but someday I will work more on these other artists. Through our case study of Grant Wood, this paper will examine the afterlife of so-called Victorian architecture in the 20s and 30s, arguing that Downing's influence continued into the 20th century through the survival of houses influenced by his publications. These extant houses became compelling subjects of interest as the Victorian revival got underway. Today, architectural historians are much more specific in labeling the many different non-classical styles of domestic architecture, from Queen Anne to Second Empire Baroque and everything in between, in the long period of the reign of Queen Victoria, which is 1837 to 1901. But circa 1930, critics, historians, and artists such as Wood used the catch-all term Victorian liberally. As styles changed, 19th century American architecture was lambasted and subjected to decay and demolition. But attitudes began to shift in the 20s and 30s at the height of the colonial revival. In this period, the magazine Antiques published articles grudgingly calling for an interest in Victorian objects. In 1924, a collector wrote, quote, "Those of us who enjoy the thrill of antiquing well know that the antique shops are beginning to exhibit many Victorian oddities." In 1933, the magazine Antiques published a special issue with Queen Victoria on the cover. The issue included an essay called Victorian Art and Victorian Taste by Fisk Kimball, director of the Pennsylvania, now Philadelphia, Museum of Art. Kimball's essay describes the recent exhibition at the Museum of Victorian Art and begins with the notion that Victorian art is, as he puts it, still unsympathetic to us. But he continues, we are finding some of the manifestations of Victorian art at least endurable. He explains that, quote, each generation detests the arts of its fathers, hesitantly tolerates that of its grandfathers, and takes to its bosom that of its great-grandfathers, end quote, thereby explaining the popularity of earlier styles like the colonial style that had been popular since the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876. A review in Art News of the exhibition remarked that the period, quote, has been execrated and ridiculed as have few artistic periods in history. But by the end of the 1930s, Victoriana had become fashionable, according to an announcement about an exhibition on Victorian and Edwardian dresses in the bulletin of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So here's a quote. For over a decade now, there has been an increasing tendency to appreciate, and as a result, to preserve, the furniture and other decorative arts of the Victorian era. This has indeed progressed to a point where the creation of pseudo-Victorian interiors is on occasion to be encountered. The revival, therefore, has arrived at a fashionable stage, end quote. Grant Wood had participated in this Victorian revival. Wood had worked as an interior decorator earlier in his career, and in 1935 he transformed a second-floor room above a restaurant in Iowa City into a Victorian parlor and dining room for the tongue-in-cheek organization, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Speakers at the University of Iowa. The group had formed in response to a lack of proper venues for entertaining out-of-town speakers. And I can tell you things have improved greatly. Thank goodness. Although I would have liked to have been entertained in this room. Wood called the room's decoration, this is Wood's quote, the worst style of the Victorian period, in a nod perhaps to the period's detractors, although the art historian Wanda Korn has called the room a lovingly and carefully executed piece of work. Guests, some grinning and others appropriately dour, dressed up for neo-Victorian photographs complete with fake beards. Here's some humor, right? Here we see a photograph of Wood and his fellow regionalist painter Thomas Hart Benton at the first party held in the room after Benton's lecture in January 1935, as well as some other guests posing for their photographs. Wanda Korn has argued that the Victorian revival is a parallel to the contemporaneous colonial revival, but it presents an alternative narrative. For Wood, it was personal, as the style of architecture and interior decoration reminded him of his youth in the 1890s in Anamosa. Upon the death of his father in 1901, Wood had moved with his family to Cedar Rapids at the age of 10. Korn writes, but having experienced a bifurcated life, 10 years on a farm, followed by 30 in Cedar Rapids, Wood recognized that the insular, rural world into which he had been born was slowly disappearing, that in his own lifetime, the telephone, tractor, automobile, radio, and cinema were bringing that era to an end. As Korn has argued, Iowans had no colonial past, and so their Victorian heritage presented a substitute. Wood himself has spent his early years in a Victorian farmhouse, which you see two pictures of on the top here, about 4 miles up the road from the town of Anamosa. His father had built the house, seen here, in 1885, around the time the Jacques House in Eldon was built. Both the Jacques House and Wood's house are vernacular concoctions with pointed gables. But the Victorian revival was not limited to the Midwestern United States. This Victorian revival was prevalent on the long-settled East Coast as well. Indeed, the landscapes of New England and New York were rich with Victorian buildings, a circumstance that inspired Lincoln Kirstein to compile a photographic survey of 19th century architecture with the help of the architect John Brooks Wheelwright and the photographer Walker Evans in 1931. Kirstein was a founder at Harvard of the literary magazine Hound and Horn, and later co-founded the New York City Ballet. An amateur architectural historian, Kirstein was fascinated with 19th century vernacular architecture in the vicinity of Boston, and taught Evans to value these neglected buildings. Evans later said, quote, I'm interested in what's called vernacular. For example, finished, I mean educated architecture, doesn't interest me. But I love to find American vernacular. So in other words, he likes architecture designed by those Downing called the uneducated builders. In 1933, Lincoln Kirstein curated an exhibition of 39 photographs by Walker Evans of Victorian architecture at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the result of their excursions in search of old buildings in New England and New York. Now, this 1933 exhibition predates his more famous exhibition called American Photographs, which happened in 1938 at MoMA, which was the first one-person photography exhibition at that museum. Kirstein announced the exhibition, which was called Walker Evans Photographs of 19th Century Houses, in the Museum of Modern Art Bulletin, and explained how they located the buildings photographed for inclusion in the exhibition. And I love this story. If you can imagine, before the internet, this is how they did things. These houses were found by searching in an automobile with the photographic equipment in the rumble, wherever Evans chanced to be for a sufficient length of time. It is a painfully haphazard method, limited by time, money, and insufficient information. So basically drove around looking for houses. Evans returned to some buildings repeatedly in order to find the brilliant sunlight that he favored with no shadows from trees or other buildings. We imagine him, like Grant Wood, shouting "stop" to his mates when he spotted a house to photograph. On a visit to Poughkeepsie, Evans discovered such a house. Despite overcast skies and his predilection for bright sunshine, Evans documented the house with his camera. Gothic Gate Cottage near Poughkeepsie, New York, shows a Carpenter Gothic house with multiple gables, pinnacles, verge board, hood moldings, diamond-paned lancet art windows, and the ubiquitous veranda. Known in the 20th century as the Pink House, the James Winslow Gatehouse stood on Route 9 opposite the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery from its erection in the mid-19th century until the roadway was widened in 1961. Preservationist Benjamin West Frazier, a key player in the dismantling and relocation of the country house Boscobel from Westchester County to Garrison, New York in 1956, acquired the gatehouse from the state and took the house apart, measuring, numbering, and photographing each piece so that it could be reconstructed at a later date. A fire destroyed these records in 1966, and a barn collapse had exposed the house components to the elements at the time when the New York Times published this article on Frazier and his rescue attempt in 1976. The fate of the gatehouse highlights the ephemeral quality of these old houses. In his MoMA announcement, Kirstein recognized the peril of 19th century Victorian architecture, writing, quote, "These wooden houses disintegrate almost between snaps of the lens. Many shown in these photographs no longer stand." Indeed, Kirstein's project was explicitly documentary. He wrote, quote, "Photography is in essence a scientifically accurate process for the reproduction of objective appearances, a stationary magic that fixes a second from time's passage on a single plane. Its greatest service is documentary." Walker Evans's photographs are such perfect documents that their excellence is not assertive. In his series of American Federal and Victorian architecture taken over the last 4 years, he is providing illustrations for a monumental history of the American art of building in its most imaginative and impermanent period, end quote. Significantly, Kirstein and Evans' project predates the work beginning in 1933 for the Historic American Building Survey, which is also known as HABS, a National Park Service program aimed at both documenting early American architecture and putting to work unemployed architects to photograph, measure, and research these buildings during the Great Depression. Indeed, HABS was chartered the month Evans's MoMA exhibition opened in New York in 1933. MoMA's press release about the 1933 Evans exhibition describes the subject of the show as, quote, "the history of a seldom studied phase of American architecture, the unjustly ridiculed houses of the Italian villa school, the Gothic revival, and the mansard roof." The Walker Evans exhibition at MoMA in 1933 was on view alongside an exhibition of paintings by Edward Hopper. As Kirstein noted, the houses in Evans's photographs, quote, "seem to exist in an airless atmosphere, much as they exist in the airless nostalgia for the past to which Edward Hopper and his noble canvases pays a more personal tribute," end quote. This comparison between Hopper's House by the Railroad from 1925, which was shown in his MoMA exhibition in 1933, and Evans's folk Victorian house with jigsaw ornament gables and porch, Nyack, New York, present two houses as forlorn, empty vessels with no life within. The for rent sign visible on the porch of the house in Evans's photograph underscores the fact that this house is uninhabited and reminds the viewer of the historical context of the Great Depression. Indeed, Evans favored unoccupied houses. A house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, this is the Sarah Coburn House, was built in 1841, proclaims its emptiness with a large for sale sign. Evans manages to photograph the houses in his series without the distraction of passers-by, making the houses mysterious and unknowable. Once they functioned as homes, as places of comfort and retreat, but now they are haunted reminders of the seemingly long ago Victorian age. The wooden house in Cambridge is especially disconcerting, with its enormously large two-story pointed arch openings, surmounted by a steeply pitched roof, the eave of which is decorated with verge board. A small Gothic window sits uncomfortably in the gable. The two-story porch is supported by fluted Doric columns, making the house an unlikely coalescence of Gothic and Greek Revival styles. This is a great unknown for your American art history students. Like, what's going on in this house? Uneducated builders, I guess. Art historian Haran Barnaby points out those two pointed arch openings are like what he calls dark hooded eyes, challenging us to confront the house's architectural anomalies. Like the Jacques House in Iowa, this house on a leafy Cambridge street fails to follow Downing's instructions and even flagrantly dismisses them. While many of the houses photographed by Evans relate sometimes only superficially to Downing's designs, Evans did photograph at least one house with a stronger link to Downing, which is the Angier House, designed by Downing and his architectural collaborator Alexander Jackson Davis in 1842 to 43 in Medford, Massachusetts. The house is not in Somerville, but that was what was mistakenly inscribed on the print. As historian David Schuyler has pointed out, the Angier House resembles quite closely Design 2 from Downing's cottage residences. Well maintained at the time of Evans's photograph and still extant today, the Angier House is almost as lifeless as Evans's other Victorian houses, except in this case, the open door hints at possible use, as if its occupant has just stepped in or out. But such ambiguity can be eerie. About Evans's photograph, wooden Gothic house near Nyack, New York, Haran writes, "The absurdity of the Gothic aspiration is redolent of a haunted house film set, defined by a comical spookiness, underscored with a sense of the ephemeral, via the paper-thin materiality of the perforated ornamentation. In this image, there's a tension between the house as a home and its absent occupants. In these photographs, houses can never fully operate as homes because, at least from the evidence presented, the occupants are always missing. These buildings could be abandoned and the inhabitants homeless or even murdered," end quote. Indeed, in Evans's photograph of the Poughkeepsie house, the lighting is otherworldly and even spooky, attributes that act as a foil to the gingerbread pleasantry of the cottage. Interestingly, scholars have also given Grant Wood's American Gothic the literary Gothic treatment. Summarizing the common theme in American Gothic scholarship, historian Aaron Sachs writes, "Or does the word Gothic in the picture's title imply something more ominous? Is the pitchfork a symbol of the devil? What might these people be hiding? Are they haunted by the small town secrets that were the standbys of Gothic literature in America? Seduction, incest, physical and psychological torture, murder, possession? Did Wood dream up this scene back when he was an art student, paying for classes by working the night shift at a mortuary?" Well, so far I have found little evidence, and if anyone knows otherwise, please let me know, that Wood was a reader of either British or American Gothic fiction. Wood's Quaker father would not allow his son to read fantastic stories such as Grimm's fairy tales, and while he mentions Charles Dickens in his series of articles published in a local newspaper about his travels in Europe, I have not found Wood to be a Gothic literature fan. Walker Evans, on the other hand, was familiar enough with Horace Walpole, author of what is considered the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto from 1764, and William Beckford, author of the exotic Gothic classic Vathek, 1786, to mention them in an article in Architectural Forum in 1962. Downing, of course, did not intend his houses to be Gothic in the literary sense. As historian Adam Sweeting notes, quote, "Downing sought to evoke a mood diametrically opposed to Poe's by cleansing the terror from the latter conceptions of Gothic. In place of Gothic horror, he called for an architecture that retained the shadows and gables, but endowed them with the power to soothe." How aware was Grant Wood, we wonder, of Downing's publications? While my research is ongoing, I have not found evidence that Wood knew of Downing. Again, if anyone knows otherwise, let me know. Instead of Downing's writings on Gothic revival, Wood's experience of the Gothic revival in Iowa was filtered through his exposure to authentic medieval architecture in Europe. Wood went to Paris in 1920 and traveled to Europe for 14 months in 1923 to 24, spending time in France and Italy. He returned to Paris in 1926. In late 1928, he spent 3 months in Munich supervising the creation of stained glass for his window at the Cedar Rapids Veterans Memorial Building. While abroad, Wood was fascinated with thresholds, and Gothic pointed arch openings are a theme during this time. And here we see 2 examples. We can understand Wood's interest in Gothic architecture by looking at his artistic training in his early years. While in high school, Wood had taken a correspondence course from The Craftsman, Gustav Stickley's arts and crafts journal. Directly following his high school graduation in 1910, Wood enrolled in a summer course at the Minneapolis School of Design and Handicraft to study under the influence of architect and arts and crafts designer Ernest Batchelder, a Ruskin devotee whose articles Wood had read in The Craftsman. Batchelder directed the summer school in Minneapolis between 1905 and 1909, and Wood arrived in 1910. So he might not have studied directly under Batchelder, but the designer influenced him a great deal. Wood studied Batchelder's teachings before he went to Europe. So did these teachings and writings prepare him to experience Gothic architecture? I think the answer is yes. Comparing a page from Batchelder's article, The Abiding Lesson of Gothic Architecture, which is on the left, which appeared in The Craftsman in 1909, to one of Wood's paintings, Marketplace, Nuremberg, 1928, it is clear that Batchelder's article illustrations had become rooted in Wood's memory. The year Wood studied in Minneapolis, Batchelder published his book, Design in Theory and Practice. That was 1910. In this book, Batchelder tackles the subject of Gothic revival architecture by channeling Ruskin's theory of the happy craftsman. If Wood was exposed to these ideas while a follower of Batchelder's, it helps us to understand his reaction to the Jacques House. Batchelder writes, and it is the utter lack of imagination that makes all modern adaptations of Gothic architecture incapable of awakening a spark of enthusiasm. One returns to the old cathedral day after day, and each visit reveals new beauty. Even back away in cobwebbed corners, one comes upon the soul stuff of some humble workaday fellow who wrought in the same spirit and with the same sincerity of purpose as the master who built the pulpit. But in our modern adaptations, there is neither interest nor reason in the arbitrary disposition of details in cement and plaster and papier-mâché and cast iron. We have a husk without meat, a body into which no soul can be conjured to take its abode, end quote. Here I contrast a photograph of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, which is folded over and truncated. You can see it's a little messed up here. But this is from the collection of scrapbooks compiled by Nan Wood Graham about her brother's European sojourns, and I compare it here to the Jacques House in Eldon. Surely Wood's exposure to Batchelder's ideas about the difference between European Gothic and American Gothic influenced his experience of the Gothic Revival cottage in Eldon. His sister Nan later wrote, Grant had long been intrigued by the arched Gothic windows copied from the massive stone cathedrals of Europe and placed in frame houses in rural Iowa. Indeed, Wood does not see these Gothic Revival cottages as importations from English architecture, which is what they were, but as uniquely American adaptations of medieval European Gothic church architecture. He does not appear to be familiar with Downing or the pattern books of the 19th century. Hence the title of the painting is American Gothic, as opposed to French, German, or English Gothic. After viewing European architecture on his travels, Wood returned to his native Iowa. 5 years after painting American Gothic, Wood wrote about regionalism in 1935 in Revolt Against the City, describing the inward turn of the United States during the Great Depression. He writes, in short, America has turned introspective. It is certain that the Depression era has stimulated us to a reevaluation of our resources in both art and economics, and that this turning of our eyes inward upon ourselves has awakened to us values which were little known before the grand crash of 1929 and which are chiefly non-urban. Choosing the Jacques House as a subject for his painting underscores his desire to turn introspective because he sees these structures as uniquely American. He later stated, our cardboard frame houses on Iowa farms are especially suggestive of the Middle Western civilization. At the end of his biography on Downing, historian David Schuyler notes that later generations of builders had long since forgotten Downing. But he writes that, quote, thousands of cottages and farmhouses that display the central gable and veranda, ornamental brackets, board and batten construction, or other elements of residential design he popularized are really a testament to Downing's influence. But Wood is seemingly one of these residents who had long since forgotten Downing. While artists and designers began to appreciate Victorian architecture in the 1920s and 30s, it will not be until the 1950s that amateurs and scholars alike begin to take an interest specifically in A.J. Downing. In 1950, George Tatum wrote a dissertation at Princeton on Downing. In 1953, Yale architectural historian Vincent Scully expanded his early study of Newport architecture and what he called the stick style into a long article which was published in Art Bulletin, and then he followed up that with his seminal book called The Shingle Style, which you see here. That was from 1955. In this book, he argues that Downing's advocacy of wooden cottages harmonizing with their rural environment prefigured 20th century modern architecture. Meanwhile, also in 1955, amateur architectural historian John Moss published an article in American Heritage entitled In Defense of the Victorian House, in which he writes that Gothic revival was, quote, promoted in print by Andrew Jackson Downing and most successfully put into practice by Alexander Jackson Davis. Moss notes that the designs vary from the baronial estates of the Hudson Valley to the Carpenter Gothic in what he calls 1,000 towns. He laments that, quote, the period has been so neglected that no study has yet been made of this delightful gingerbread and its thousands of patterns. Yet it is a vigorous and authentic American folk art. So this is his book, The Gingerbread Age, which he published in 1957. So this is when Downing first kind of comes out of the shadows and people are writing books about him. So it seems unlikely that Wood would have known of Downing. The afterlife of Downing's Victorian cottages continues even today, though, in popular culture. So I'm about to end here, but my husband is from Cooperstown, New York, and we moved there when we were married in the late 1990s. Each Christmas, a little cottage magically appears on the corner of Main and Pioneer Streets. Within this tidy little house trimmed with verge boards, Santa Claus listens as local children share their holiday wish lists. Meanwhile, in Iowa, the Jacques House has been renamed the American Gothic House, and a visitor center has been constructed nearby to cater to tourists waiting to have their picture taken in front of the little structure, which of course I did. I didn't put the picture in here, but I didn't want to embarrass Paula Moore, who was with me that day, if you know her. While most visitors to the American Gothic House are assuredly unaware of Downing and the pattern book tradition of the 19th century, the house itself, the American Gothic House, serves as a tangible reminder of Downing's widespread influence well beyond his death in 1852. That Wood, Evans, and other artists of the 1930s took note of these houses and in some instances documented their decay suggests nostalgia for the smiling lawns and tasteful cottages promoted by Downing long ago. Thank you.
Well, we're going to switch now into another large category that I'm looking very forward to hearing how Wood fits into and has relationships with that great photography movement, FSA, in the 1930s, the Farm Security Administration. And today our speaker will be James Swensen, who is a associate professor of art. Excuse me, I guess maybe your assistant, is that true? Good. Well, congratulations. I think it's in order then. Associate professor at the, of art history at Brigham Young University, and he teaches there in the art history department. His research, scholarship, and teaching it has focused on the history of American photography, and he's recently completed 2 books that give, obviously, attention to that subject. One, Picturing Migrants, The Grapes of Wrath in New Deal Documentary Photography, published by the University of Oklahoma Press, and the second, In a Rugged Land, an investigation of Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange's 3 Mormon Towns collaboration, 1953-54. And recently, he's had an essay in an anthology called Maynard Dixon and the Forgotten Man. The anthology is called Locating American Art by Ashgate Press, and that's just come out this year. So his talk today is entitled On Common Ground, Grant Wood and the Photography of the Farm Security Administration. James.
Thank you, Wanda. Thanks, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference. It's been great. I've enjoyed it. Whether we like it or not, we live in an age of memes, and arguably, no other work has been memed, copied, parodied, or mimicked more than Grant Wood's 1930 painting, American Gothic. There we are. As Wanda Korn and others have documented, the various guises of this work has taken over the past 85 years is astonishing. And in fact, it's proved to be a remarkably adaptable work. As you can see in this example, right? You knew it was going to come, right? Or my particular favorite, this, which greeted me as I got off the plane in Cedar Rapids. And the more I thought about it, is that the perfect face for an airport bathroom? I think it is. Right? One of the more serious, though, uses of Wood's ubiquitous image is Gordon Parks' 1942 photograph of the same name. Created under the aegis of the Farm Security Administration's historical section under Roy Stryker, Parks's work substitutes Wood's Iowans with an African-American woman who cleaned and scrubbed the floors of the New Deal offices. My presentation today seeks to explore the interplay between Grant Wood and the photography of the FSA. When Gordon Parks captured Ella Watson in the guise of American Gothic in 1942, it confirmed a connection that was already entrenched by the time the young artist photographed the Washington, D.C. charwoman. My narrative, therefore, begins at the end, this work being the most overt allusion to Wood and his work in the FSA archive. Although Parks' account of this event will vary over time, there are two consistent parts of his narrative, which are important for my argument today. First, when he posed Watson, he did so in what he called, quote, a Grant Wood style, unquote. Knowing that this image was a not so subtle critique on America and that he was overdoing it in his own words, he was curious to see what his boss, Roy Stryker, thought. Roy Stryker didn't like it at all. His response clearly acknowledged that the young African Americans' repurposing of an iconic American image would strike a strong chord that could possibly get him, his photographers, and his agency in trouble with federal administrators who were looking, in fact, biting at the bit to get rid of Stryker and his project. For my purposes today, both reactions are important. They, together, reveal that the influence of Wood, and American Gothic in particular, were both directly and indirectly present in the work of the FSA. Parks's image represents the smoking gun, so to speak, but there are other ways in which Wood and his influence are reflected in the work of Stryker and his photographers. Traditionally, the FSA photographers have not been included in the discussion with regionalism. Again, the painters that we particularly associate with the 1920s and 1930s. And the reasons for this are many, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but even for a term, regionalism, that is so porous, it never included photography. First, regionalism was also exclusive. It worked within the discourse of art and was dominated by painters, especially the ones we know well, including Grant Wood, Thomas Hart Benton, and John Stuart Curry. While Wood and the FSA might not have shared the same ism, they were clearly interested in the same material, and both, it could be argued, fit more comfortably under the larger umbrella of the American scene. Key among the ways in which they were connected was their interest in rural America. This was their common ground. Wood's love for his native Iowa. Wood's love for his native Iowa is well known. The state, with its rolling hills, cornfields, and rivers, was his home and moral center. Born in Kansas and raised in Montrose, Colorado, Stryker shared a similar devotion to Middle America. And I actually like this comparison because it looks like they could have been separated at birth. According to F. Jack Hurley, the West was his country. He loved his books and read as often as possible, but he loved the earthy, rough and tumble way of his region too, unquote. His love of this place was manifested in many ways, and he passed this on to his photographers. In July 1936, Stryker wrote to Arthur Rothstein, who was then traveling through the West, "For my benefit, Please get some pictures of prairie dog towns and prairie dogs. No set of Western pictures is complete without these, unquote. Most importantly, Wood and Stryker shared a similar ideology of the land and the American values assigned to it. They were provincial, self-confirmed hicks who knew city life but maintained their tie to homeland. In his 1935 essay, Revolt Against the City, Wood wrote, quote, "Each section of America has a personality of its own, its physiography, industry, psychology." He continues, quote, "Thinking artists and writers who have passed their formative years in these regions will, by taking analysis, work out and interpret their productions of these varying personalities." Stryker could easily have echoed Wood's words, with the one important distinction that he would have included photographers along with historians and writers. Sharing a connection to the land was not the only thing bringing Wood and the FSA together. Like Stryker, Wood was an avid supporter of Roosevelt's New Deal, and it was said, in fact, that he was a New Dealer before there was a New Deal. In 1934, Wood worked for the Public Works of Art Project, or PWAP, a forerunner of the more famous WPA. Later on, Stryker was actually friends with Adrian Dornbush, who was in the special skills branch of the WPA's resettlement division. 3 years earlier, Dornbush, who you see here sitting next to Grant Wood on his right, Grant Wood's the one in overalls, and Dornbush is sporting the Adolf Hitler mustache, which was popular before the war. 3 years earlier, even before Dornbush knew Stryker, he was a member of the Stone City Art Colony and taught alongside Wood. But in truth, looking at the FSA and Wood is a lopsided comparison. Stryker and his photographers were in a position to be influenced by Wood far more than he would have probably been influenced by them. And even though photography played a role in his earlier career, and he was even sometimes touted as having a photographic objectivity, it would be difficult to surmise that the FSA photographers profoundly influenced him. Moreover, the FSA operated in an era in which Wood and his work were well known, and this is particularly true of American Gothic, which was already famous by the time that the FSA was in operation. And when looking at Dorothea Lange's well-known Migrant Mother from 1936, it's hard not to see the possible connection. And just so you know, in this discussion, people have looked at the ways in which Migrant Mother, the reasons why it resonates so well with Western audiences, and they tend to associate Migrant Mother with, say, a Giovanni Bellini painting, right, of a Christ, right, flanked by angels. But in many ways, the more appropriate comparison might be American Gothic. From the time Lange took her photograph, the photograph of Florence Thompson, the Migrant Mother, was believed to provide insight into the plight of families from Middle America. Juxtaposed, we see stability has been replaced by instability and the transitory. Wood and Lange's images provide a before and after, a visual synopsis of what was happening to farmers across the Midwest. In another comparison, we can see Wood's 1931 fall plowing, which shows a pastoral Iowan landscape with rolling hills and a plow in the foreground that effectively and even beautifully tills the earth. When Arthur Rothstein visited the panhandle of Oklahoma 5 years later, he recorded a very different scene. Now I know this is the audience that I don't want to mess this up, I know that Oklahoma is not Iowa. He laughed. But at the time, and I think it's important to even remember now, that distinction might not be as obvious to Americans. The Midwest, they might believe, is the Midwest. Farmland is farmland. But in Rothstein's series, we see that the rich brown soil of Wood has been replaced by sand and dust, the result of erosion and ineffective farming practices. Again, the images of the Dust Bowl. The John Deere moldboard is abandoned and now worthless. In his caption, Rothstein instructed his audience, saying, here is the plow that broke the plain. Look at it now. While the previous comparisons with Wood in his work are indirect, in the photography of Russell Lee, we may see the strongest connections to a, quote, Grant Wood style. Indeed, if there is any FSA photographer who could lay claim to the title of a regionalist, it may be Lee. The only key members of Stryker's photo team to be born in the Midwest were Walker Evans, who Kerry just did a great job of explaining, right, and Russell Lee. And while the cosmopolitan Evans had a complicated connection to his roots, Lee embraced them. He was born in Ottawa, Illinois in 1903 to a family with means but rooted to the land. After a rocky upbringing, Lee obtained a degree in chemical engineering, but soon shifted his energies toward painting and art. Lee's total transformation was propelled by his 1927 marriage to Doris Emmerich, who would be known for a rich and seemingly homespun style that often focused on rural life. Together, the two traveled to museums in Europe and eventually studied at art centers in Kansas City and San Francisco, where they became friends with Diego Vera and Arnold Blanche. In 1931, they moved to New York City, where they studied the Art Students League. Russell Lee actually studies with John Sloan. And they wintered in the city and spent their summers living and working in the Woodstock Art Colony. And later, Doris Lee would move there permanently. Although Russell Lee nor his biographers ever made the connection to Grant Wood, they must have been at least acquaintances. Through their travels, right, the Lees made several connections. They had several overlapping circles, and it was known specifically that Doris and Wood were friends at the time. They were actually represented by the same gallery in New York City, and in the summer of 1934, they were among the 23 who met in Benton's Manhattan apartment, a meeting that eventually led to the establishment of the Associated American Artists, which was referred to last night. Doris Lee was also one of the last friends to visit Wood prior to his death in 1941. Doris and Grant Wood shared similar interests and a focus on rural life in America, and even their most well-known works share a similar history. In 1935, her painting Thanksgiving received the prestigious Logan Purchase Prize from the Art Institute of Chicago, the same institution that had sponsored and bought American Gothic years earlier. The prize brought her instant recognition, as well as the scorn of the prize's benefactor, Josephine Logan. Like American Gothic, it resonated with the American audience, and one commentator even called the painting, quote, a comic valentine of U.S. farm life, unquote. Around the same time that his wife's career was taking off, Russell Lee realized that his talents were not in painting. In fact, if you look at his paintings, they're just not very good. While he saw Doris's career as progressing rapidly, he confronted the reality that his own work was stagnant. Encouraged by Ben Shahn, Lee turned to photography, and in a remarkably short amount of time, the medium dominated his attention and his energies. He was soon out photographing the hard-scrabble existence of New York City's street dwellers and coal mining camps in Pennsylvania. And in the summer of 1936, the painter Joe Jones, who was his friend, informed Lee of the historical section, and by that autumn, Lee was hired by Stryker to replace Carl Meidens, who was leaving to join the newly formed Life magazine. Stryker first sent Russell Lee to document the Jersey homestead in Hightown, New Jersey. For his second assignment, Stryker sent his new employee on the road, back to the Midwest. Offering suggestions and encouragement throughout his travels, Stryker was eager to see what Russell Lee could do. His home base for this assignment, by the way, was his mother-in-law's home in Illinois. Stryker and Lee's initial correspondence took place between Washington, D.C. and Woodstock. The difference in geography marks the transition for Lee. For nearly a decade, in Woodstock, San Francisco, and New York City, Lee was fully integrated in the world of American art. He knew the participants and their interests well. With the move to D.C. and Stryker, Lee underwent another important transformation. Although Russell Lee today is remembered and considered an important pioneer of documentary photography, a, quote, taxonomist with a camera, and even the embodiment of the FSA, he was an artist first, photographer second. In his work in Iowa in the winter of 1936, it's possible to see the influence of his former existence. In Iowa, and yes, it would have to take place in Iowa, it's even possible to see the impact of Grant Wood. How could Lee, a regionalist with a camera, not reference or play off Wood and his art in this state? One of the clearest ways to see the connection is through Lee's photographs of local art and folk traditions. From the very beginning of his career with Stryker, he consistently photographed all sorts of objects that had very little to do with the needs of his agency. He was just interested in folk art, and many of them were meant to be humorous. Obviously, this one's not really catching on as well as I hoped after last night. But everywhere he went, he photographed signs, paintings, homemade crafts, family portraits, photographs. Now, Wood, too, was known for his interests in items with a distinct American quality, or the bits of American things that are just too good to lose. He took inspiration from a wide variety of objects, including Currier and Ives prints, frontier photographs, old maps and atlases, folk paintings, and quilts. Wood's interests in this regard can be seen in many of his works, but is probably best illustrated by Overmantel, a reference to, as Korn noted, a piece of Staffordshire blue china his family owned and an older American tradition. Lee, too, photographed overmantels, such as this one in New Mexico, as well as folk paintings, wonderfully presented on pattern wallpaper in Illinois. In Iowa in 1936, Lee recorded a distinctive American rocking chair and a wall painting under a pressed tin ceiling in a cafe of Anwa. If you're from this town, I apologize for slaughtering your town's name. On that same trip, in the home of a farmer named Fred Rowe, Lee photographed the family's portrait of a male ancestor, as well as a grandmother or great-grandmother in a matching frame, right? And if you look at this, it would be hard not to imagine that Lee did not see this image as a direct reference to American Gothic. And I apologize, too, for this stretched image next. From the woman's tight-necked blouse, pinned together tightly by a circular cameo, to the hair parted precisely down the middle, this figure might as well be the same woman, now slightly aged, in Wood's most famous painting. To get to remote communities in Iowa, Lee traveled more than 300 miles on icy and snow-packed roads. Working in temperatures as low as 15 degrees below zero, he traveled along the eastern edge of Iowa and then along the state's northern border. As this illustrated hand-colored map from Lee shows, these were areas that had been hit hard by drought and other trying conditions. Before leaving for the Midwest, Stryker informed Lee that the primary pursuit was to explore the fragile nature of farm tenancy. The nation had experienced a rise in the number of farm tenants, uprooted from rented lands to look for work and better lives elsewhere. Migrants, as Stryker's photographers knew well, were to be found on highways all across the United States. By 1936, Iowan farmers had already experienced what the publication Wallace's Farmer called, quote, long years on the downgrade, unquote. Plummeting farm prices after World War I drastically affected Iowan farmers nearly a decade before the crash in 1929. This was exacerbated by drought in 1930 and another in 1934, which was touted as the worst in history. These conditions helped make Iowa the logical place to explore the problems of farm tenancy. According to the WPA's Federal Writer's Guide to the state, in 1935, tenant farmers cultivated 49.6% of Iowa farms. 71%, the guide continues, of the value of Iowa farm real estate at that time did not belong to the immediate farm operator. Throughout his research in the field and his ability to secure the trust of his subjects, Lee photographed a number of tenant farmers still clinging to their land. On several occasions, he documented husbands and wives standing in front of their homes, which take on a subtle Grant Wood style. Indeed, there is a repeating echo of American Gothic in these portraits, and while not unique to Lee or his work in December of 1936, the number of occasions in which he posed these couples outside their homes is not common in the FSA archive, and I've looked. The men characteristically wear overalls, or what James Agee called the standard working garment of the American farmer, and the women don patterned dresses, as you can see, often under winter coats. An examination of these portraits, however, further reveals the reality of life in Iowa in 1936. In contrast to Wood's painting, The homes range from sturdy clapboard sidings to tar paper shacks, and their clothing is piebald and worn. Maybe that's not as obvious here. You can see it in others. As Mrs. Warren Johnson, an Iowan farmwoman, noted, quote, "Overalls and cotton dresses, again, are the mark of the farmer, and they are well patched," unquote. Iowa's hard times are visible in these photographs, and this is particularly true in the raw portrait of Mike Maloney and his wife, which were residents of Denison, Iowa, the site 3 years earlier of a farm riot that witnessed 800 farmers who overran and injured local sheriffs and deputies before being quelled by a military guard. Lee's photograph represents a very different vision of Iowa, obviously, than the one that Grant created only 6 years earlier. Lee's captions reveal that these families are tenants and facing difficult times. Mr. Rauhausen, a father of 7, who you see here, was out of work and looking for relief. The Marriotts of Esterville were to lose their farm to a private loan company. In his notes, in fact in the caption, Lee made it clear that the federal government was assisting these farmers. The Freddies from Armstrong, for example, were to receive relief from a resettlement loan. And yet, even with this support, we see examples like the Bantas, who, Lee reported in his caption, had 10 days of groceries left. That was it. After which they were going to have to sell off their livestock, which they had already used their WPA loan to buy food for. These were hard times indeed. During his time in Iowa, Lee observed that many of these farm families were on the breaking point. Writing to Stryker, Lee recorded, quote, "In the opinion of these local men, there is danger of an uprising among families here unless immediate aid is forthcoming," unquote. The fact that Lee encountered a very different Iowa from the one projected by Wood was not a surprise. In 1935, Lincoln Kirstein, who Kerry referenced in her presentation earlier today, chastised Wood for his, quote, "sweetness upon which his prestige is based," unquote. Kirstein explained, quote, and this is a long quote, "We will have to cauterize that charm, which no matter how accurately he paints, clouds truth. And more than any mere technical mastery, he will have to gain some trace of insight into the real weather of his Middle West. Dust storms and drought, slaughtered pigs, unsown crops, and crops plowed under. An element of tragedy would make his cleanly farmers less quaint, but closer to the spirit of the Gothic, which is no less beautiful than it is so grim," unquote. The most pitiful of Lee's American Gothic-like farm couples was undoubtedly Andrew and Theresia Ostermeyer, who lived near Otto, a small community outside of Sioux City. German immigrants from Bavaria, the 70-year-old Ostermeyers, had recently lost their farm on the Little Sioux River for failing to pay their loan. In Lee's first images, we see them standing helplessly in front of their simple frame house. The photographer then, though, focused on his lens on the weathered, hardened hands of Theresia. In her hands, it was possible to see the grim beauty that Kirstein advocated. Lee's images of the Ostermeyers' hands also provides a nice comparison to Wood's portrait of his mother, titled Woman with Plants. Hattie Weaver Wood, who died in 1935, was only 4 years older than Theresia, and both exhibit age and toil in their uncovered hands. Yet there are important differences. There is a softness and even a tenderness seen in Wood's affectionate portrait of his mother. Lee's focus on Ostermeyer's knotted hands confronts the viewer, forcing them to acknowledge labor and strain. The difference in vantage point is also instructive. As James Dennis observed, Wood's use of, quote, "an elevated position above a hill farm landscape of fields and trees with her head against the sky symbolizes his mother's exalted status as a farm wife and earthbound mother," unquote. Lee's photograph, in contrast, fragments the older woman and forces the viewer's gaze downward. This is a very different type of earthbound. "In the erosion of these deformed fingers," critic Elizabeth McCausland wrote, quote, "is to be seen the symbol of social distortion and deformation. Waste is to be read here, as is read in lands washed down to the sea by floods, in dust storms and in drought bowls, unquote. Lee did not spend Christmas Eve 1936 with his family or friends. In fact, his time on the road and his complete dedication to his new craft helped end his marriage to Doris. They divorced in 1938. Rather, he visited the young family of Earl Pauley near Smithfield, Iowa. Lee's photographs reveal a family living in destitution. The younger children are in near rags, bare-legged, and living in a ramshackle dwelling that could not keep out the bitter cold that Lee continued to describe in his letters. His most touching image, which you see here, shows the 4 young children eating their Yuletide meal of, quote, potatoes, cabbage, and pie, making the most of it as only children can do. In so many ways, this photograph contrasts sharply with, and could even be an indictment of, rosier pictures of rural Iowan life, like the agrarian vision of Wood's Dinner for the Threshers from 1934, or even the rollicking festival of his wife's Thanksgiving. Lee's work confirmed Stuart Davis's accusation that the regionalists were, quote, neglected factual observation to spin sugar-coated yarns about the wonderful meals farm help get in Iowa, unquote. After his work in Iowa, Lee did not return home or to D.C. He was supposed to be on a 3-week trip, but that 3-week trip turned out to be a 9-month excursion. The images of Teresa Ostermeyer's weathered hands and the meager holiday meal of the Powleys, which you just saw, became 2 of his most important and most remembered photographs. For Stryker, Lee's work in Iowa was good, but still had room for improvement. Writing him in January, Stryker provided a telling critique of his work in the Hawkeye State. Quote, "You have done many pictures of families standing in front of their house or shack. They appear a bit stiff, taken in this manner. This would be all right, provided we could show members of the same family in the house and doing various things," unquote. In other words, Stryker seemed to be suggesting or saying that Lee should no longer follow this Grant Wood template and that he should not be posing his subjects like American Gothic. While Russell Lee was skilled at taking photographs of rural plight, time and time again, though, he also revealed that he could make much rosier photographs. His image of William Rawl, a Kansas farmer from Sheridan County, from Sheridan County, not to be confused with the other one, from Kansas, is a good example. Here Lee portrayed the prosperous farmer standing next to his wife, the literal fruits of their labors proudly displayed in their hands. And I know this image was not meant to be funny, but I really find this one to be strangely funny, right? Presented in this manner, they tap into that powerful myth and reality of the farmer, which Wood saw as a theme that was central and dominant in America. The photographs of the Rawls share a strong connection, I think, to American Gothic, and even more specifically to Wood's series portraying the fruits of the farmer, which you can see here on the right. This takes us back to Gordon Parks and his creation of his own American Gothic. Born in Kansas, Parks experienced profound hardships and, like nearly all black men of his generation, was affected by segregation and racism. Despite mounting obstacles, Parks was able to educate himself and became interested in photography. As a porter on the Northern Pacific Railroad, he first encountered the work of the FSA through a magazine that was discarded. On layovers in Chicago, he frequented the Art Institute, where he undoubtedly would have encountered American Gothic. In 1941, he received the Julius Rosenwald Fellowship, which enabled him to travel to Washington to intern with a very skeptical Stryker in the FSA. Rather than send him out on the road as he did with Russell Lee, Stryker sent Parks around Washington without a camera. And he soon realized and learned that the capital was not what he had envisioned. Denied service at a movie theater and at a department store because of the color of his skin, Parks found out what prejudice was really like in this southern town. Mississippi couldn't be much worse, Parks recalled. Angered and frustrated, Parks was encouraged to find more constructive ways of fighting the bigotry he encountered. Stryker, in fact, instructed him, the younger photographer, to talk to Ella Watson, the charwoman who cleaned the offices of the FSA at night. Parks approached her cautiously and learned her tragic story. He then took her to the office of a white woman who had the same education and experience as Watson, but who had been promoted to the position of a notary and received, again, a higher pay. Quote, "In the heat of all this," Parks recounts, quote, "I took her into this woman's office, and there was the American flag, and I stood her up with her mop, Grant Wood style, and did this marvelous portrait, which Stryker thought it was just about the end. He said, 'My God, this can't be published, but it's a start.' In another account, Stryker stated that this image would get them both fired." Parks was deliberate in his actions and his choices in the creation of this work. The use of the American flag as a backdrop was an important gesture. Not only did American Gothic represent the Midwest, but as a national icon, it too became a potent symbol of the United States. In 1934, Life magazine claimed that Wood's work was, quote, "as genuine a U.S. stamp as a hot dog stand or a baseball game," unquote. Fortune magazine in 1941 proposed that the painting almost by itself could be an effective war poster. In essence, as Stryker must have known, Parks smartly blasphemed two national symbols. It was seditious, or as Erica Doss recently pointed out as early as last night, it was dangerously funny. Ella Watson was also a good visual replacement. As Parks observes, quote, she was a tall, spindly woman with sharp features. Her hair was swept back in graying temples. A sharp intelligence shone in the eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses, unquote. Without knowing it, this description sounds a lot like the people in Grant Wood's painting. Yet alone with a broom and a mop substituted for a pitchfork, she became a symbol of poverty and the face of a less celebrated but equally real American type. As Richard Wright commented, quote, "Our women are the most circumscribed and tragic objects to be found in our lives," unquote. In all, Parks believed that this photograph, more than any other in his long and great career, expressed his desires to use the camera as a tool to fight, quote, "the evil of poverty and the evil of racism," unquote. It demonstrated, yet again, the adaptability of Wood's work. And like American Gothic, Parks's has its own backstory, and I end with this. Parks's image is particularly important, I think, today in an era in which we recognize that Black Lives Matter. In 2015, author and critic Carol Boston Weatherford published an account of Parks's story with illustrations by Jamie Kristoff, which followed the encounter between the photographer, his boss, and the DC charwoman. In this retelling, there is no reference to the original American Gothic. Rather, Parks' most famous shot, like the image it originally parodied, has become an icon on its own terms and on its own path. Thank you.
And because I know the next speaker very well, I can tell you you're about ready to listen to another very well-crafted paper, which is probably one of the best things a professor who once had this person as a student can say, because Annelise from the very beginning has been, from my experience with her, has always been a good storyteller, and that's exactly what she's going to be talking about today. Annelise is today the Assistant Curator of American Art at the Art Institute of Chicago, which of course has been home to American Gothic ever since 1930. And she, with her two fellow curators in her department, have just had the great success of an exhibition called America After the Fall, Painting in the 1930s. Some of you perhaps have a chance to see it this summer. It is now at the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris, and will go on to the Royal Academy of Arts in London before the show is over. And one thing that's very interesting is that I believe it's the first time American Gothic's ever left the country. North America. Oh, went to Canada once, okay. But this is really pretty significant, and not only did it go as part of this major exhibition, on the era of the Depression years, but also they used it as the cover of the book. So it's getting a lot of notice as kind of a key piece or branding of this particular exhibition. And I certainly look forward to hearing what the Brits and the French critics will make of this image. I happen to collect takeoffs of American Gothic, and one of the phenomena of the last maybe 5, possibly 7 years is that the image has gone global, and it is being used by other cultures and other countries, not just our own. And I'm suspecting that we'll see a whole bunch of European versions of them coming along now that this show is opened in Paris. But to get to Annelise's work, she co-curated this exhibition and is a contributor to the accompanying catalog. She's published several essays on Gilded Age and progressive era civic art, on particularly the suffrage pageantry in Winterthur Portfolio and the mural program at the Library of Congress in American Art. She also, I have to say, did wonderful sidebars for a book that we did together called Women Building History, which was about the 1893 Women's Building at the Chicago Fair. Currently, she's working on her own exhibition project entitled John Singer Sargent and Chicago's Gilded Age, which will open in the summer of 2018 at the Art Institute. She serves on the board of what we call familiarly AHA, which is Association of the Historians of American Art, and she holds her PhD in art history from Stanford University. Today, she'll be speaking on, and this is first a quote, "Something of color and imagination," end quote. Grant Wood, storytelling, and the past's appeal in Depression-era America. Annelise.
Thank you, Wanda, and good morning, and thank you to the Grant Wood Art Colony for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. See the title there? Let's get started. Parson Weems' Fable is a decidedly playful painting premised on an invitation. George Washington's early biographer, Mason Locke Weems, blocks his gaze with ours, the corners of his closed lips hinting at a smile. Standing in the foreground, he parts the red velvet curtain and points to the injured cherry tree behind him. As viewers, we turn our attention there. A young Washington, his father, and of course that hatchet, form a mise-en-scène, illuminated by seeming footlights at left. The colonial garb, the African-American man and woman working the fields, or working the land in the middle distance, and the composition's title, clearly visible on the frame Grant Wood himself made, likewise serve as ready clues that the picture does not, at least at first glance, address the 1930s present of the artist's own day, but rather a time apart. With emphatic gazes, gestures, and stage direction, Parson Weems' Fable invites viewers to look, to recollect, and to respond. Grant Wood was a skilled visual storyteller, and it is his playful engagement with the past and his knack for spinning tales in paint that marks a defining contribution to American modernism. In the case of Parson Weems' Fable, the painting's awaited display at the Whitney Biennial in 1940 created such a buzz that Wood took to the press this time to explain, this time in words, just what he was up to. Quote, "When I was a boy, we all learned the story of George Washington and the cherry tree and accepted it as gospel truth," unquote. He continued, "It is of course good that we are wiser today and recognize historical fact from historical fiction. Still, when we began to ridicule the story of George and the cherry tree and quit teaching it to our children, something of color and imagination departed from American life. It is this something that I'm interested in helping to preserve," unquote. Wood described these tall tales as we've heard, bits of American folklore that are too good to lose, unquote, making the case that communal stories, embellishments and all, were vital to the Depression-era present. Amid economic, social, and political upheaval, the nation's past or more precisely, various versions of the past, represented a powerful resource for defining culture and community for artists and their contemporary audiences. In both words and paint, Grant Wood clearly asserted his own role as interpreter and storyteller. In this New York Times article of January 3rd, 1940, Wood places himself front and center in the famous tale. Quote, "In making my interpretation, I have taken a tip from the good parson and have used my imagination freely," unquote. The painting is, in the artist's own words, my version of George and the Cherry Tree, unquote. And the painting itself showcases this authorial agency. The visual logic of the composition hinges not only on the act of telling, but on that of showing. Parson Weems' fable is not simply about the myth of Washington, but about myth-making itself as a distinct historical event, as art historian Cecile Whiting has demonstrated. An array of antiquated elements function as compositional building blocks, fit together with the seams still visible, so that the viewer, like Wood the painter and Weems the fabler, can partake in the crafting. Wood collapsed chronologies, intermingling personages and artifacts from across centuries. He placed an iconic portrait by Gilbert Stuart of President Washington atop a boy's body, the 6-year-old persona of Weems's tale. This image, known as the Athenaeum portrait, would have likely been in the mind's eye of 1930s viewers who were well versed at the time in this particular likeness of the president due to its prevalent use in bicentennial celebrations of Washington's birth throughout 1932 and on the $1 bill at this point. While the fable transpires in Virginia, the brick house in the scene is Wood's own home in Iowa, which is the subject of our film tonight, an antebellum structure that recently had been restored by the artist. Wood took liberties with the stuff of history, not to pull the wool over his audience's eyes, but to rekindle a common American heritage through doses of fact, fiction, humor, and artistry. Such tinkering with the elements of old aligns with the concept of a quote-unquote usable past, first outlined in 1918 by the literary critic and historian Van Wyck Brooks. Brooks endowed creative producers with unequivocal agency. One's stance towards the past should not be objective, he advised, but emphatically selective. A serviceable past, in his opinion, would take form by actively embracing some elements while discarding others. And he wrote, quote, "The past is an inexhaustible storehouse of apt attitudes and adaptable ideals. It opens of itself at the touch of desire. It yields up now this treasure, now that, to anyone who comes to it armed with a capacity for personal choices," unquote. The past's value lay in how it could inform actions and enrich understandings in the present. And Brooks's ideas held sway during the Depression years. As one critic put it in 1934, quote, "Today the trouble seems to be that we have too many pasts and that the proponents of one will have nothing to do with the others," unquote. This paper examines Grant Wood as visual storyteller during the 1930s. It also considers Wood's efforts alongside those of his contemporaries, including Aaron Douglas, Edward Hopper, Doris Lee, Ben Shahn, and Charles Sheeler, who likewise called on the past to reimagine understandings of local and national identity during the Depression years. Working in a range of styles from realism to abstraction, artists revived the old in varying ways, marshaling diverse origin stories and historical artifacts to shape an array of modernisms. My aim is to see Grant Wood's storytelling as one effort among many, while also acknowledging the artist's distinctive place as a national raconteur. The inclination to look backward was a broad cultural phenomenon during the Great Depression. During the 1920s, writers and historians had made heroes of their contemporaries, ratcheting down the status of the country's storied leaders, and unraveling in turn the grand narratives and myths of earlier eras. Yet amid uncertain times the following decade, the nation's past registered anew as a source of guidance for the present. Under President Franklin Roosevelt, the federal government sponsored many historically spirited projects. New Deal murals were among the most visible of these, with the past taking center stage in many of the decorations in post offices and other public buildings as part of the Public Works of Art project, the Work Progress Administration's Federal Art Project, and the Treasury Department's section of painting and sculpture. And I show you one example here by John Stuart Curry in the Department of Interior building, where the Oklahoma land rush becomes the subject of a scaled-up history painting by Curry. A preservationist and documentary spirit motivated such efforts as the Index of American Design, which was part of the FAP, and the formation of the National Archives. And the image at the bottom is one of the 18,000 some watercolors that were done as part of the index to document folk art and decorative art for modern artists, for contemporary source material. Additionally, the colonial revival in full swing in the 1930s influenced the activities of architects, collectors, museums, historical societies, and others. From folk art to historical fiction, living history museums to bicentennials and regional expositions, Depression-era society discovered a host of usable paths. In Daughters of Revolution of 1932, Wood demonstrated that the nation's material culture and tales of old could breathe new life into an American painting rooted in figuration and narrative. With tight lips and unblinking stares, the three women confront the viewer with haughty self-possession and utmost seriousness. Standing in front of a print of Emanuel Leutze's famed 1851 painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, the ladies silently declare their role as guardians of America's heroic origins. Depression-era women, they seem to fit more easily into the 18th or 19th century, relics of bygone generations. Wood took aim at such ancestral pretentiousness. We'll leave it at that. Okay. Playing with the past for satirical ends to visually undercut the sense of ownership and entitlement that swelled among colonial societies like the Daughters of the American Revolution. Making use of familiar, well-worn characters and storylines, Wood nevertheless crafted a send-up that was topical, humorous, and engagingly insightful. Wood brought history into his painting in several ways, creating layers of visual history telling, from heroic to genealogical, memorializing to satirical, that imbue the work's forms with a rich range of meanings. An undoing of genealogical errors is at the heart of the artist's play with history. His shorthand title, a purposeful move to skirt legal retaliation, did not fool audiences, nor was it intended to. These are definitely three ladies of the Daughters of the American Revolution, or DAR. Rather than individuals, Wood portrayed types. As one reporter wryly noted, quote, Wood says that there is a particular kind of mouth exclusive with Daughters of Revolution. Wood also sharpened his commentary with the depiction of the central woman's bony, ringless fingers, raising a tightly grasped teacup. One of the ancestral lines from revolutionary past to 20th century present, defining entry into the organization's ranks, ostensibly halts with the spinster daughter. Further, the teacup she holds is itself an heirloom, valued for its ties to familial origin stories. Wood, like his Dar figures, valued the material culture of yesteryear, but objected to its use as a symbol or leverage of status. The painter declared, quote, I don't like to have anyone try to set up an aristocracy of birth in a republic, unquote. With the portrayal of his three Tory gals, as he called them, Wood refashioned ancestral power into something deserving of scrutiny by Depression-era audiences. Further, Wood's aesthetic satire indirectly called upon a different mode of history telling, one that memorialized. Local DAR members had stirred up controversy a few years earlier after learning that the artist's stained glass windows for the Veterans Memorial Building in Cedar Rapids was produced by German glassmakers. Members succeeded in delaying the window's dedication for decades, long after Wood's death. Wood, in turn, redirected the likely sting from this hubbub to his daughter's composition, wherein three DAR ladies stand seemingly unaware that they are indeed safeguarding a German-American masterpiece in Leutz's painting. And so daughters as well engaged with heroic and mythic retellings of the past. Leutz's monumental painting is shown here in the form of a popular lithographic print, domesticated in scale and reinterpreted once more by Wood's brush. Grand Manner history painting of the 19th century made icons of early American figures, ensuring that chiseled profiles, gallant poses, and crystallized acts of courage endured in the nation's collective memory. By the 1930s, such ennobling and didactic history paintings like those of Leutz's had long fallen out of favor with scholars, although they did remain popular with public audiences. In fact, Washington Crossing the Delaware had been rolled up in storage at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for 3 years, when in January 1932, the museum president mandated that it be rehung in time for that year's bicentennial celebrations, making clear, however, in a press statement that the decision was decided by factors other than aesthetics. According to the museum president, Leutz's painting, quote, cannot be classified as a masterpiece, nor is it an accurate historical record. Nevertheless, we believe that it is both fitting and desirable that this picture should be shown at the time of the Washington bicentennial, because in spite of obvious defects, it has great interest for many people of this country, unquote. And the monumental canvas and its mythic heroics indeed drew crowds at the Met during the Depression. Grant Wood tapped into the era's Washington mania, juxtaposing the founding fathers' larger-than-life persona and his impeccable yet improbable stance with the three stolid ladies raising a teacup in his honor. Neither party, Wood seems to say, has dibs on the whole story. It is in the conversations between them that the artists found richness. And contemporary audiences responded. The painting was immediately exhibited, traveling to New York, Chicago, Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Los Angeles, and Paris over the next 6 years. DAR members across the U.S. were particularly vocal, their reactions amplified by reporters eager for good material. Members of the Pittsburgh chapter demanded its removal from the Carnegie International Exhibition in 1933, to no avail. A local DAR member in Cedar Rapids wrote a letter of protest to a gallery director there, likewise calling it for it to be taken off public view, and newspapers as far as Albuquerque picked up the story. And Baltimore members, this is my favorite, the Baltimore members somehow planned to quote-unquote ignore the painting when it went on display at the Baltimore Museum of Art in 1934. Yet despite all the DAR indignation that made headlines, reaction to Daughters varied, with many among the organization's ranks relishing the lampoon. A journalist for the Cedar Rapids Gazette noted, quote, only Iowa DARs have been able to take it from Grant Wood. A reproduction of it flashed on a screen at a state convention of the DARs drew so much applause and laughter that it had to be brought back by 2 encores, unquote. The general public flocked to the composition as well. According to the Chicago Tribune, Daughters of Revolution was the most popular painting at the Century of Progress exposition in 1934. Wood employed oppositional tactics, as he did in Daughters, in several of his figurative paintings in the early 1930s, beginning with American Gothic. And Wanda Korn has called them, quote-unquote, narratives of confrontation. Pictures powered by conflict and dissonance, often accompanied by a smile and a free zone of familiarity. I would like to suggest that Wood's strength as a visual storyteller lies in part in this structural maneuver. The lines are clearly drawn, us versus them, old versus new, connected versus out of touch. But as viewers, our allegiances and sentiments are hardly tidy or one-sided. Storytelling through oppositions was a signature approach for Wood during the Great Depression, but other artists employed different strategies and visual forms to stage shared histories. While Wood and Daughters incorporated history painting with a wink and nod to its exalted premise, Aaron Douglas's stance toward the genre was one of celebration and expansion. Large-scale history painting did gain renewed visibility in the 1930s in the form of newly executed mural paintings, thousands done on federal rolls, and in the case of Douglas's Aspiration, which you see here, a commissioned assignment from the Texas Centennial Exposition in 1936. While New Deal-era murals were overwhelmingly representational in style, painters did demonstrate a range of artistic expression. A leading painter of the Harlem Renaissance, Douglas applied his avant-garde European training to American subjects, past and present. In his mural cycle for the Hall of Negro Life, he shaped a distinct modernist vision that brought together African American history, African iconology, humanistic themes, and geometric abstraction. Aspiration is the fourth and final panel in a series that showcased African American contributions to national life, from the forced labor of slavery to the intellectual acumen of contemporary professionals in the arts and sciences. With silhouetted forms, overlapping planes, radiating stars and circles, and a palette of blues, mauves, and yellows, the artist deployed an inventive vocabulary to address age-old themes of strife, self-betterment, and communal prosperity. Douglas modeled an alternative and inclusive public history with his Texas Centennial murals, ennobling an American past built upon Black agency and achievement. His usable past stretched from ancient Africa to the 20th century cities of the industrial North. While Douglas took a long view, shaping a narrative of progress that transpired over generations, social realist Ben Shahn, in contrast, pulled his subject from the headlines. Creating a series of works on the trial and 1927 execution of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, Shahn focused his attention on the very recent past. Italian immigrants and political radicals, Sacco and Vanzetti were sentenced to death for the armed robbery and murder of two men at a shoe factory in Massachusetts. Convicted on circumstantial evidence and denied a retrial, the two became martyrs in the eyes of contemporaries in the U.S. and around the globe, victims of the era's climate of suspicion surrounding leftist politics and radicalism. In 1931-32, Shahn created The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti, a monumental canvas depicting the two executed men lying in their coffins in the foreground. The judge for the case appears in a background window, while the three individuals who had rejected a new trial stand as attendants at the coffins, proffering lilies in mourning. With a vocabulary both economic and expressive, Shahn contrasted the calm dignity of Sacco and Vanzetti with the dressed-up authority, judicial robes, top hats, academic garb, of those empowered to pass judgment. His flat areas of color, calligraphic lines, and selective exaggerations of forms infused the composition with directness and political charge. Shahn's satiric vision stung all the more because such recent polemical history still reverberated in the 1930s present. This was a usable past, not quite past. Rather than recent events with global reach or national histories and myth, some artists were drawn to more local and lived versions of the past, often anchored by a strong attachment to place. Charles Sheeler's paintings of domestic interiors, including Home Sweet Home, come to mind in this respect. Reconciling a precisionist aesthetic with a sustained appetite for folk art and early American furnishings was Sheeler's grand project, as Wanda has shown us. In her words, quote, Sheeler made the past, or representations of it, safe for modernists, unquote. With his collection of old handcrafted objects, the artist reconstructed a regionalist vision rooted in the rural East. In this painting, he features his home in South Salem, New York, arranging color, form, and pattern in jigsaw puzzle precision. Shaker rugs, table, and bench, all seen from above, function both as objects of Americana and as planar abstractions. An early American ladder-back chair, strong in stature, is drawn up closely to a modern furnace, which is positioned in front of the room's old wood-burning fireplace. Sheeler harmonizes the clean forms of this industrial machine with the plain-spoken objects around it. Strong spotlighting casts exaggerated shadows behind the chair, and onto the stairs, further animating the albeit uninhabited room with an overlapping and interplay of formal elements. In this lovingly crafted, painted interior, Sheeler stitched together old and new in appealing ways. Perhaps less well-known is Morris Cantor, who likewise brought a modernist vocabulary to still lifes of domestic interiors replete with objects of old. A Russian immigrant, Cantor worked in both figurative and abstract modes during his career. His Haunted House of 1930 is a fantastical rendering of a home that he had rented in rural Massachusetts. The room features 2 ladder-back chairs, a colonial portrait, and a marine painting of a schooner, flanked by 2 candlestick holders over a large hearth. In the composition's darkened edges, Cantor sketched a nightscape of the town, building facades, roofs, and illuminated windows, creating an incongruous transition from interior to exterior space. Indeed, the shadowy form at right is that of a human figure, an unknown presence encroaching on the comforts of the sitting room. The artist later recounted, quote, "The humble interior of the American farmhouse, old and quaint, with its peculiar moldy smell, the fading beauty of old plaster, discolored by time and living, layers upon layers of wallpaper, all turned my imagination to the past, to the people who had lived there and gone. My emotions were aroused," unquote. Local legend had it that the house was haunted, such storytelling inviting Cantor, in turn, to formulate a surrealist musing on its residues of the past. His appropriation of a New England town's shared memories rings an eerie note, since this slice of Americana feels more strange than familiar. Haunted House, then, comments on inherited traditions, drawing attention to the constructed nature of culture, both national and local. Explorations of a lived, felt past extended to the urban scene as well during the Depression years, as in Edward Hopper's Early Sunday Morning, painted like Cantor's Haunted House and American Gothic in 1930. Hopper turned to his immediate environs in lower Manhattan, streets that he walked and knew well, for source material, focusing on a modest Victorian-era structure that housed shops at ground level and residential apartments above. Amid a rising city of skyscrapers, such architecture was a vestige of old New York, with an emphatically horizontal composition and frontal view, emptied of people and bustle but filled with sunlight. Hopper interwove present and past, stilling and aggrandizing a remnant of lived experience that was fast becoming outmoded. As in Cantor's painting, memory and a sense of strangeness are at play in Early Sunday Morning. Yet, instead of surrealist hauntings, Hopper distilled harmonized and poeticized his subject, arranging ordinary shop fronts, barber pole, curtained windows, and cornice roofline into a serene streetscape that evokes both tangible familiarity and a projected artifact of old. Lastly, I would like to look at two paintings that treat national themes through regionalist expressions. Thanksgiving, we've already seen this morning, a bustling scene of holiday preparations in a Midwestern kitchen by Doris Lee, a native of Illinois, and The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, Grant Wood's fanciful presentation of a famed patriotic deed. Lee located the American ritual of family and food in a modest, folksy interior. The farmhouse kitchen, with its cast iron stove, linoleum flooring, simple furniture, and fresh foodstuffs, serves as a nostalgic setting for Thanksgiving's shared traditions, revered all the more during the Depression's toughest years. Yet this vision of Americana is not unaffected. While Lee's deliberately broad and rough approach proffers directness and accessibility, the painting's naive style was nonetheless filtered through a modernist lens. Working in a representational mode, Lee also explored the explicitly formal qualities of color, form, movement, and patterning, bespeaking her avant-garde training in France. Lee achieved her first major success when Thanksgiving was included in the Art Institute of Chicago's annual exhibition of American painting and sculpture in 1935. Awarded the exhibition's foremost prize, the composition received uncommon publicity when the museum donor and namesake of the prize denounced it as quote-unquote atrocious. The painting drew crowds, as these comments usually do, all the while among the museum-going public. Lee's brand of modernism put a vernacular twist on national rituals, locating Americana in the hinterlands. In The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, Wood overlays local sensibilities on an episode of storytelling with national import. He takes up the legend of Revere riding on horseback through the countryside in April 1775 to alert the New England towns of Medford, Lexington, and Concord to the Patriots' call to arms. Wood composed a bird's eye view of a once sleepy village, its verdant landscape cut by a road, a concrete road, as Erica reminded us last night, past several homes and a steepled church. A handful of tiny figures stand outside in doorways and at windows, signaling that Revere, the miniature form atop a galloping horse, has communicated his fateful message. Although the myth takes place in colonial Massachusetts, the painted landscape with its bluffs and rolling hills comfortably resembles the artist's native Iowa, akin to such works as Stone City. Yet the scene's dollhouse-like scale and dramatic illumination, with seemingly modern-day electric lighting emanating from several homes, transform the locale into an almost otherworldly place, a fairy tale stage set. The tale of Paul Revere was indeed one of those bits of American folklore that was too good to lose, and Wood thus took up the material with a wink and nod towards the creative untruths that colored society's engagement with communal histories. The Revere legend grew during the Civil War era, when Henry Wadsworth Longfellow penned Paul Revere's Ride, which appeared both in the Atlantic Monthly and in his Tales of a Wayside Inn. Poet and myth-maker, Longfellow embellished history, canonizing Revere as singular messenger and symbol of civic duty, heroic action, and national character. The poem found its way into American curricula and history books in the late 19th century, becoming the stuff of a schoolchild's lesson during Wood's own youth. Like Revere and Longfellow, Wood is messenger and mythmaker. He both honors the tale and reinvents it. The painting is an invitation to recollect, to dream, to knowingly indulge in a bit of nostalgia. Folkloric yarns, with their historic tenor and familiar heroics, offered a site for shared experiences, and through Wood's paintbrush, a rallying call of sorts to revive American stories during the tumultuous years of the Great Depression. Throughout the 1930s, the past proved a tangible, important, and remarkably varied point of departure for modern American artists. While Wood looked to national folklore and material culture of his native Iowa as threads of continuity amid the changes of modern life, Ben Shahn translated recent headlines about working-class immigrants and social injustice into a memorializing, monumental composition with decided historical weight. Scaling up grand progress narratives of African American achievement, Aaron Douglas made the human figure an integral component of his modernist aesthetic, comprising crisp lines, planar geometries, and bold color. A collector, Charles Sheeler, made new objects about old objects. His paintings did not tell stories like those by Grant Wood or Morris Cantor, but rather served as invitations to discern harmonies of form and craftsmanship across time. American histories, shared, contested, discarded, mythologized, reinvented, renewed, provided fertile terrain for Depression-era painters to root aesthetic experimentation and related explorations of artistic, regional, and national identity. Grant Wood was especially skilled in foregrounding acts of telling in his compositions and giving the past contemporary resonance for his audiences. And I show you here one installation view from our exhibition this summer at the Art Institute America After the Fall, where we were lucky enough to hang Daughters of Revolution next to Parson Weems' Fable. The strong narratives, relatable figures, and time-worn objects in paintings like The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, Daughters of Revolution, and Parson Weems' Fable make clear his investment in storytelling. Yet we should not lose sight of the sleights of hand involved in making it look so easy. After all, despite the decidedly tight-lipped demeanor of those three dames, Daughters of Revolution had much to say. While many Depression-era artists used history as a point of departure, Wood presented history, giving us an opportunity as viewers to reconnect to it, to reconsider it, and above all, to indulge in it together. Thank you.